I want to welcome Tom Spirock to our meeting this evening. Tom lives in New Jersey, and he was gracious enough to agree to join us tonight. He's going to present the latest results using lucky imaging technique with the 13-inch f10 Schupmann telescope at Stellophane in Springfield, Vermont, and the 6-inch f15 Warner and Swasey refractor with a Brashear lens at Mount Wilson in Southern California. First, the unique and advantageous characteristics of the Schupmann telescope will be discussed, along with a brief history and description of the 6-inch Warner and Swasey refractor at Mount Wilson. Next, the lucky imaging technique will be described. Finally, a comprehensive list of resulting images will be presented, including Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and both full disk and high-resolution images of the moon. Just as a little background for Tom, he's been a member of the Springfield telescope makers at Stellophane since 1989. He was instrumental in building both the 13-inch Schupmann telescope and the McGregor Observatory at Stellafane, both of which were completed in 1995. He earned a PhD from the New Jersey Institute of Technology, working to develop the latest iteration of the solar vector magnetograph at the Big Bear Solar Observatory in Southern California in 2005. And during the past several years, he's been applying the lucky imaging technique to data collected with both the 13-inch and the 6-inch and the 16-inch f10 Meade and 60-inch Cassegrain telescopes at Mount Wilson. So for those of you especially that enjoy trying to image planets as I do, I hope you've been looking forward to this, and I think it'll be a great presentation. So thank you again, Tom, and you can start anytime you want.
Okay, so thanks for having me tonight. As you already heard, this will be about the latest lucky imaging results using the 13-inch Schupmann telescope at Stellophane. And actually not only the 6-inch Warner and Swasey, but some other telescopes at Mount Wilson. Here's our brief outline. I expect that most people have been in your club have been to Stellophane, but I'll just go over very briefly what it is. We'll talk about the Schupmann telescope and why we want to use a Schupmann, some recent improvements to the scope, very briefly about the 6-inch Warner and Swasey, and then we'll go over the lucky imaging technique somewhat briefly. There's not enough time to really get into the details, so it won't be a how-to, but we'll basically skim over the steps that are required, and then we'll look at some images. So very briefly, Stellophane. Strictly speaking, Stellophane is Latin and Anglo-Saxon. It means shrine to the stars. And strictly speaking, it's the name of the pink clubhouse of the Springfield telescope makers on Breezy Hill in Springfield, Vermont. But of course, over the years, it has come to be known as the annual Telescope Makers Convention. So our top picture here shows the pink clubhouse on the right and the Porter turret telescope on the left during convention with people milling about. And the lower picture shows more of the telescopes that are set up typically on a Saturday morning for the mechanical judging and people looking at the scopes. The convention and the club was started by Russell Porter back in the early 1920s. He was a telescope maker, an architect, Arctic explorer, et cetera. And if you're interested, you can find used on the internet by Burton Willard, his biography. Porter was a very mechanical genius and such, so he taught himself how to make telescopes. When he came back to Springfield in 1919, he got working with other machinists, and he got a telescope making class together. We just celebrated actually our 101st anniversary to that on August 17th, 1920. And shortly after that, a few years later, they had the first official meeting in 1923 and the first convention in 1926. It's been pretty much going on ever since, except for sometime during and a bit after World War II. And of course, we missed last year because of the virus. And one thing is, history is very important to the Stellophane. We see two pictures here, one in 1954 and the other in 2015. And from about the same position, and they basically look the same. So we try to keep tabs of our history and keep everything as original as we can. So now we'll talk about the Schupmann telescope. There's a lot to learn about Schupmanns, and again, we just have some brief time to go over it quickly here. if you're really interested in getting into the gory details, you can get Jim Daly's book. Jim Daly is one of our senior members and one of our best telescope makers. He wrote a book with Wilman Bell called The Schupmann Telescope. And if you get this book, he'll teach you all about the history and how to design and build one. And the left picture is Jim Daly with a 14-inch objective that he made. So now we'll talk about why do we want to use a Schupmann telescope. And the goal when imaging the planets and the moon is to capture the most subtle details on the target as possible. And what causes degradation in those fine details is scattering and smear of your image. So the idea of the Schupmann telescope is to minimize those bad qualities. So a few characteristics of a Schupmann is a perfectly achromatic refractor. There's zero color. It has no central obstruction to scatter light. It can correct for atmospheric dispersion, which is particularly important right now when Jupiter and Saturn are low on the southern horizon. And we'll get into each of these details in somewhat detail in the following slides. One of the mirrors is a back surface mirror, and back surface mirrors scatter less than front surface. All of the mirrors involved are smaller than the primary aperture. So overall, the mirrors scatter less than, for example, a Newtonian of the equivalent aperture. And these optics in general are all spherical, so they're all basically, on an individual basis, somewhat easy to make. And over here on the right side, we have the basic layout of the Schupmann, where here on the left side, we have a 13-inch primary objective. It's a single lens. The light comes from the left to the right. It focuses, it's an f10 130-inch focal length. It focuses on about a 3-inch field mirror, which is not a flat. It has some power. The light then diverges, and the purpose of the field mirror is to re-image the primary onto what's called a Mangan mirror here at the center at this tip. And this is a back surface mirror, which we'll get into a little bit shortly. So both sides of this mirror are ground polished and figured, and the back surface is silvered. So the light literally goes through the glass like a lens, bounces off the silver, and then comes back out of the glass, and then focuses onto our new right angle to our eyepiece or our camera. So again, we talked about the fact that one of the advantages of a Schupmann is essentially a zero color refractor. So I'm sure many of us know when you pass light through a single lens, the lens affects each color a little bit differently. So the blue light focuses shortest, the green light focuses medium, and the red light focuses longest. So you can never get a good quality focus for this lens because all of the colors have different focal lengths. This chart here on the right side, the x-axis is a plot of the wavelength or the color. So 700 is our red, 550 is our green, 400 is our blue, and then the y-axis is the focal length. So the plot of this lens is this blue line where we see that each color has a different focal length. So we can never get a good quality focus for this lens. So one solution is to put another lens. And we see here it makes it a little bit better, although not completely perfect. And here on the right side, we see this yellow plot for this achromat. And we see it's better than the blue line, but still not so good. So one improvement is we can put a third lens, and we're getting an even better focus. We're now operating on this red line. So between blue and red, we have a pretty good focus, not completely perfect. But one issue is we now have 3 lenses with 6 surfaces, and all of these surfaces not only have to be very high quality on an individual basis, but they all have to be very closely ground, polished, and figured relative to each other. So making this lens is somewhat difficult. So here's a basic optical schematic of the Schupmann. Here on the upper left, we have our 13-inch single lens. The light comes to this focus point on this curved field mirror, but again, we see that all of the colors are separated. This field mirror re-images the objective onto this back surface Mangan mirror, where both the front and the back are ground polished and figured. The silver reflective is applied to the back. The light, when the light comes out, all the colors have been fixed, so white light comes out. And then we have our right angle to our eyepiece or our camera. So it's essentially a zero color refractor. Another disadvantage of some telescopes is central obstruction. Here's a photograph of a telescope a young man brought to convention a few years ago. It's a typical Newtonian. So we have our central obstruction and our spider, and these aspects scatter light, which degrades the fine details that we're trying to acquire. So here on the upper right, this is a simulation of a Newtonian without a central obstruction. We see our nice airy disk and our rings, but when you put the central obstruction, some of that light is scattered onto the outer rings, and this will decrease our contrast. So as with all refractors, removing the central obstruction increases the quality of the image. We also said that the Schupmann corrects for atmospheric dispersion. On this cartoon here on the left side, we have Saturn low on the horizon, and as the white light from Saturn comes through, the air acts like a lens or and it disperses the colors just like a lens does. So the blue is refracted more than the green, which is refracted more than the red. So what we actually see is this image of Saturn that is smeared out in color a little bit. Now here on the right side, which is back to our schematic of the Schupmann, what I did not mention before is that this field mirror is on an XY stage and can be tilted with some knobs that stick out the back of the telescope. And this mirror can be adjusted in X and Y axis. So everything has to be aligned just right in order to correct these colors. However, this system doesn't necessarily care or know about where the colors come from. So whether the color comes from the lens or comes from the atmosphere, this field mirror can correct it. So if we're looking at Saturn, for example, later tonight, we want to image Saturn, we can tilt this mirror such that we can remove the color from Saturn that is input by the atmosphere. Also, the various mirrors in the Schupmann are smaller than the primary objective, or would be smaller than the equivalent Newtonian, for example. And the smaller the mirror, the less scatter it is from each mirror. The total surface area is about half. So the scatter from a Schupmann, the mirrors in a Schupmann are less than half of the scatter from the equivalent size of the Newtonian telescope. And in addition, with this picture we see here, this is the Mangan mirror, which is the back surface. Back surface coated mirrors scatter even less than front surface. So the short answer is the Schupmann has less scatter, and scattering light decreases the fine details we could see. And also the individual optical surfaces are easier to make. Number one, they're smaller, they're all spherical, and they have greatly reduced wedge sensitivity. So on a one-by-one basis, the individual optical surfaces are easier to make. So this is what we end up having here on the right side. It's an old photograph. We've since painted this tube a different color. And here on the left side is a painting on the wall. This is the east wall of the observatory. And one of our members who has since passed away, who was an artist, painted this cutaway drawing as if Porter was doing for the Palomar telescope of the telescope. So here now on the right side, the light is going from right to left. We have our 13-inch lens, comes to a focus on our field mirror. The light diverges to the Mangan mirror and then is re-imaged to our eyepiece or our camera. So now we'll just talk about some improvements, and this is not necessarily an improvement per se, but one thing we always have to make sure is that our optical surfaces are clean. Even though we have a very high quality telescope, dust that is covering the lens basically would do the same thing as other problems with the telescope is in that it scatters light. So even if we were to have a high quality telescope, which would give a high quality image, if the front image, objective was dusty, we would basically degrade the quality of the telescope. And cleaning lenses in this particular case is not necessarily as difficult as many people think. This is Jim Daly cleaning the lens, and he literally uses Bounty towels and Windex. You just have to be a little bit careful. You just spray the lens, dab it until you get all the major dust off, and then wipe it down. And now we're ending up with a very nice clean lens, which will not scatter any light. Also, we've recently had our Mangan mirror recoated. This coating was originally applied back in 1995, and over time, some oxidation got into the coating, so we shipped it out, and the coating was stripped off, and we got a nice new fresh coating, which is protected on the back with some black paint. And here Jim Daly is on the right side reinstalling it in the mirror mount. And here Jim is inspecting that everything is mounted correctly. On the right side, we see its tip tilt plate, so it can be adjusted and collimated correctly after it's reinstalled in the telescope. And once we put the mirrors back in, of course, we have to make sure they're all aligned. The left side is a picture of the field mirror. There's a cover over it to keep dust off, and on that cover we painted a little crosshair for alignment purposes. And on the right side it shows a laser which we put into the eyepiece, and we see that the laser comes back to the center of the field mirror, which shows us that everything is aligned correctly. Another improvement is we install the Leo stop. Now we have, do you see that this is a moving video here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a typical picture of what we see when we look through a telescope at Saturn. Saturn is wavering because of the seeing, which is created by heat waves going in front of the telescope. And all amateurs know that on a night of poor seeing, a small telescope will give a better view than a larger telescope. So what we've done is we've installed a Leo stop, which I'll talk about shortly, and it's a very quick and easy way where we can convert the 13-inch telescope into a 9-inch telescope. So we're not going to get into this in very detail, but if anyone's interested, there's a physicist named David Fried, and he basically studied the physics of the atmosphere, and basically he determined a mathematical model of what all amateurs know as we're looking through bad seeing, and that again is a smaller telescope gives a better image than a large telescope under poor seeing. And if anyone's interested, I can send those papers, but what it came down to is he made this equation where P is the probability of getting a good image. And with this equation, the capital D is the diameter or the aperture of the telescope, and R0 is the Fried parameter, and that's the size of the atmospheric cells. And what this equation tells us is the bigger the telescope, the worse probability we have of getting a good image. And again, we all know this, that a big telescope shows a worse view than a small, but it also says that the larger these R0 parameters, meaning the larger these atmospheric cells, the better the probability. And this is a plot of that equation for different size seeing, different size atmospheric cells and different size apertures. And if we take, for example, a 12.5-inch telescope on some average seeing, we, for example, see that in this particular case, what we have to take 2,000 very short images in order to get one good quality. However, if we were to convert that same telescope to an 8-inch, we now run down this line to the green line, and we now only need to take 10 images to get a good image. So we've converted 2,000, we now only need 10. And again, this is just a mathematical representation of what all amateurs are used to when we're observing planets and the moon, et cetera, at high power. But this is the basic reason and the physics of why we want to do this. And so normally what we might do is put an aperture stop over the primary aperture with a hole cut in it to 9 inches. However, instead of doing that, what we chose to do is to add a Leo stop, which is simply, again, a small aperture at an image of the primary. So we have a fold-in plate that covers part of the Mangan mirror. And here's a picture of that fold-in aperture. On the left side, we see this is the Mangan mirror, and this is this aperture, which converts the telescope to 9 inches, and it rotates on this axis. So here on the right side, we see that the aperture is removed from the light path, and we have our full 13-inch objective. And instead of doing it with electronics and motors, we kind of did it the old-fashioned Stellophane way with push-pull rods and such. So here's Jim Daly installing a rod in the underside of the telescope. And we now have this rod, which we simply can push and pull. And when we push this in, we have this lower right case where the aperture stop is in the light path and the aperture is 9-inch. When we pull this rod back, the rod pulls this aperture out of the light path, and we have our full 13 inches. And this comes in very handy when imaging the planets on nights without good seeing, which unfortunately is most nights in Vermont. So that's basically it on the Schupmann telescope. This is a picture of the Warney and Swasey 6-inch refractor with a Brashear lens at Mount Wilson. This is one of the original telescopes installed on Mount Wilson about 1910. It's just your typical 6-inch f/15 refractor from the time, and it has a weight-driven drive, which is still operational. On the right side, we see a close-up of the drive mechanism. So there's a weight that slowly drops down in the pier. When it hits the bottom, there's still the original 110 volt DC motor, which raises it up. And the scope's a little bit clunky. It has a pretty good lens. The lens has a bit of a problem, which we'll talk about later. But in general, it's a very good telescope, and it's nice to use kind of things in the old-fashioned way. So now we'll talk about lucky imaging. So I'm just going to read that left sentence because it's the basic, the whole idea. So lucky imaging is the process of capturing and saving many short exposures as rapidly as possible and selecting the good images to be aligned, average, and enhanced in post-processing. So basically, we're doing in a computer and a camera what we would do with our eye and our mind when we're looking at Jupiter or looking at Saturn. If we stare at it for long enough, we'll eventually see a few brief seconds or even less than a second of good seeing, and we will remember that, and that's on our mind will build a picture of that high quality detail. So we're doing the same thing with a camera and a computer. So the first step is to capture the raw images as short exposures as rapidly as possible. If we need to pre-align them, we do that. We then select the good ones, which we'll talk about shortly, and then align and average them. And then we can do some other processing as needed. So again, this is the same video of Saturn we had before. We've all seen this when we're looking at high power at Jupiter, Saturn, or Mars. And so keep in mind that this is our starting point, this high speed video of the blurry moving image of Saturn. So the first thing we need is a fast readout camera. I happen to use the ZWO cameras. These aren't the only cameras, there's others. This is just what I happen to use. The two basic categories are small chip and a big chip. When your planets are small, so there's no point in spending a lot of money on a camera that has a large chip if you're not going to be using it. So if you're just going to be using the planets, you can get a small chip. You can either get a color or a monochrome, and these cameras are on the order of $150, and they can upload 100 or 150 frames per second, which is and this is a pretty good price for a camera that can do this. And this is via USB 3. However, if you're going to be doing the moon, you do need a larger chip, because the small chip cameras are just, you would have to take many, many images and stitch them together. Even with a big chip, you might have to stitch 4 or 6 images together. With a small chip, it would be dozens, and that's just not practical. So if you do want to do the moon or any larger targets, you do have to get a camera with a larger chip, and of course, they are more money. And depending on what you're doing, you might need a filter wheel and some filters. So this is our starting point in our equipment, in addition to the telescope, the mount, and the computer. Fortunately, however, all the software to do all this is free. So the first step is we have to capture the raw images. I happen to use FireCapture, again, which is free, and it's open source, and there's communities on the internet where you can ask questions and get the answer. And also the person who writes the software is also free to answer questions. And the purpose of this is simply to run the camera, and the camera takes pictures as fast as it can. It uploads them to this software, and this software saves them onto your disk. So up here on the upper left, we can control our gain and our exposure. We also can control the size of the chip that we're using. We don't necessarily have to download the entire chip. If we're just taking a small planet, we can crop the chip down, download the section of the chip around the planet, because there's no need to fill your disk with a lot of blank sky. It also means you can increase the number of frames you can take per second. You also can set your, this is how you take your video. You can set your target, your filter, and basically you start and stop your video from here. This is just a real-time readout of the frames per second and the number of images you captured. This is a histogram of the image, which we'll talk about later. And there's a variety of other information. So this is an example of what we would see when we're taking a picture, in this case for the moon. But again, this runs the camera and is a free software. So after we've taken and the output of that software is a video, which we will then do the processing on later. So depending the situation, say perhaps for whatever reason your telescope drive might not be properly aligned on the pole, or if we're using that old telescope from Mount Wilson with the weight drive, it's not as high quality instrument or mechanics as a modern telescope. Maybe your planet is wobbling around too much. So there's this Planetary Image Preprocessor software, which is also free. And all this does is simply takes in a set of images, basically aligns them. This red image of Saturn is just, this is what you're telling the computer to do your alignment on. So your input is a video with the planet wobbling about, and the output is the same video where the planet is nice and steady. And again, that's free. And then the next step is to do our selection and averaging. I use AutoStacker. Again, this is free software and it's open source, and you can ask questions to a community on an email list. So you open your file, you do your analyze of the video. The output of the analysis is this chart here, where we're looking at this gray line shows the x-axis is the number of images. So in this particular case of Saturn, we see here, there's 4,976 images in this video. So in this chart, on the left side is image number 1, And on the right side is image number 4,976. And the y-axis is the quality of the seeing. So we see as this gray line jumps up and down, that is the representation of our shimmering image of Saturn. This green line is simply the same data plotted where the best image is on the left and the worst image is on the right. Then we have to select our alignment boxes, which I've done here on the right. And then you have to tell here on the middle center, upper center, how many images you want to keep. So again, we have 4,976 images total, and I've told the program to save the best 1,024. And then you simply click stack. It will find the best 1,024, align them and average them. And the output is a single exposure that is the average of these 1,024 images. And then there's, if you'd like to do some wavelet processing to bring out some images, I use Registack for this. And again, this is free. And there's this many sliders. You can adjust the noise, adjust the sharpness. These various layers work on different size features, where layer 1 works on the smallest feature, layer 6 works on the largest feature, and you have these sliders. So there are many, many different settings that you have to practice and basically see what works for your data. And the output is this final single image of Saturn that we have here, which is the average of that 1,024 image on the previous slide. Now also, this process only works if your target is not changing. The problem, for example, with the planets is they're rotating. And so if we were just to take a longer and longer video, we would basically get smearing data because the planet is literally changing as we're taking a video. So if you, instead of taking a longer and longer video, what you have to do is to take several short videos and then run it through this WinJupos program, which is also free. And you basically, when you save or went back in FireCapture, when you're setting up how to run your camera, the file name will save not only the target, but the date and the time that the image was taken. So this program can then determine how to derotate, in this case, Jupiter, such that several images will now properly align. And this is an example of what happens with WinJupos. I've taken these 4 input images, which are, each of these are the result of a 2-minute video. So from the time from the beginning of the first video to the end of the last video is about 8 minutes. And in that time, we would see Jupiter rotate and it would smear. So this WinJupos has derotated these various images so that when we align them, the features, they self-construct and don't smear out. And the result is this final image here on the right. And again, this WinJupos is free. So that's the basics of the lucky imaging technique. Those are just a general quick overview of the steps. It actually takes a lot of practice and you need a lot of experience to really get the most out of it. So now we'll talk about some results. So this is a set of Mars from the 2018 apparition. This is with 13-inch Schupmann telescope at Stellophane. The seeing wasn't that great, so we used the Leo stop and converted it to a 9-inch telescope. In addition to that, if you remember from that year, there was a big dust storm on Mars. So what we did was we used an infrared filter, and infrared can see through the dust. So we were able to see some of the albedo features. So this is a time series over the course of just 10 minutes and of Mars. And if you look close, you can see that there is some little bit of rotation during that time. And you can see that, for example, the image on the right has some more detail than the image does on the left. And that's because the seeing changed over that 10 minutes. This is an example of Mars from that same time, and where we took an image or a video of Mars with a 9-inch Schupmann, and then we removed the aperture stop and did a video with the 13. And we see, of course, the 13-inch is brighter, but we also can perhaps see that because the seeing wasn't that great, maybe we do see a little bit more detail on the 9-inch image. Here's an image, a red filtered image of Jupiter from July of 2018. It was a good seeing that night, so we used the full 13 inches of the telescope, and we had a 2x Barlow. And these are simply 2 images taken at different times. And there is, you can see quite a bit of detail in the various cloud features. This is a picture of a composite cut and paste picture of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn from the same night, July 4th, 2018. The seeing wasn't that great, so we were using the 9-inch aperture stop. But this is an example of the relative scale of the 3 planets. Mars was very near opposition, so it was relatively big. Normally, Mars is much smaller, which is why we like, of course, to observe it near opposition, because even it's small even when it's at its biggest. This is a time series of Jupiter from July 2019. This was done with a color camera. This indicates a ZWO, and this MC indicates that the camera is color, one-shot color. The seeing wasn't that great, so we were using a 9-inch aperture stop. And this is some same images from that previous set, just blown up a little bit, so we could see some more detail. And you can see over this time course that Jupiter is rotating. And then this is the single best image of that set, and that white circle is 1 arc second, and Jupiter is about 45 arc seconds across at this time. But you can see that there is some subtle detail here, and so we're getting 1 second or perhaps a little bit less. Anytime you can get less than a second, in general, you're doing pretty good. Here's some images from Saturn from 2019. Again, a comparison from the 9-inch to the 13-inch. Saturn's a little difficult. Saturn's not necessarily, the details aren't as obvious as Jupiter or Mars. Mostly we simply see the bands. From time to time, there are individual clouds pop up, but most time it's just the bands and the rings. Again, this was with a one-shot color camera, which we're able to do with the Schupmann because, as we spoke about before, there's not only 0 color in the instrument, but we can fix the color caused by the atmosphere, even though Saturn is very low. And this is just a blown up image of Saturn. That white circle is 1 arc second. But we can even see a bit of the planet through the Cassini division here. Another similar image of Saturn. Do you see the fact that Jupiter is a movie on the right side?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is actually some latest images just taken the other day. This obviously is Jupiter and Saturn. This is probably one of our better images of Saturn and Jupiter with the Schupmann. It was a particularly good night of seeing, and that movie on the right side, that's a 2-hour movie assembled from each frame is about 8 minutes. And you can see that the seeing did deteriorate during the course of that time. The first images when the red spot is on the planet are pretty good, and then the seeing does deteriorate. This is a series of Mars from last summer. One different thing here, however, is instead of using a color camera, we used red, green, and blue filters to make our color images of Mars. And the reason we did that on this particular night was because we also wanted to use the infrared, an infrared filter. So we had a monochrome camera with 4 filters: red, green, blue, and infrared. So the top row, there are actually 3 images taken for each picture: red, green, and blue, and then they were processed and assembled later. The video lengths for the red was 60 seconds, and the green and the blue were 30 seconds. So we also can take images of the moon. And in addition to simply taking a single image, we also can use what's called a high dynamic range imaging technique. And I'll explain the reason we want to do that here. If we look at this image on the left, this is what I would call a, quote, correct exposure for the moon. This below, this chart here is a histogram, which we previously saw on the FireCapture page. And recall that to a computer, an image is simply a grid of numbers. And in this particular case, in a monochrome 8-bit image, then all the numbers are from 0 to 255, where 0 represents black and 255 represents white, and all the middle numbers are various levels of gray. So here in the sky are 0s, 1s, and 2s. Here in these gray areas are the hundreds and 101s, and the bright areas are 200 or so. So this histogram is simply, this x-axis is simply the list of numbers, where on the left side is 0, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., all the way up to 255 here on the right, where the y-axis is the number of pixels at each number. So the reason, for example, we have this little peak here in the low numbers is because of all this black area. So when we're setting our exposure, the typical thing to do is set the exposure so that the brightest areas are in this region, about 2/3 to 3/4 to the right. And that makes sure that we're not overexposed. If we are overexposed, if this feature goes off the right side of this chart, all those pixels are now saturated and we have no information. So that's why we set this exposure this way. The problem is this exposure really is only good for the bright areas. It's too dim or too short of an exposure for the dark areas. So what we do is we take more than one exposure. We then increase the exposure. In this particular case, the exposure for the left image was 1 millisecond. We then increase it to 1.5 milliseconds, and you see everything gets brighter, but this area here is now a little bit too bright. We then increase it again to 2 milliseconds. Now this bright area is really too bright, but our level in the gray areas is much better. So the idea is we take 3 of these pictures and then we combine them later, extracting the high detail from each appropriate region. And our final result is an image like this. So this is actually a very high resolution image of the moon. And this is actually a montage of, there's 6 pieces that had to be put together. So this, the number of videos to create this picture was 18. We have six videos for each of 3 exposures. And the raw image is about 7,500 pixels across. So if you were to print this at 200 DPI, the moon would be 3 feet across, and you would not see any pixelation. And the software used for this is this Photomatix Essentials. And in this particular case, this software is not free. It's something on the order of $50, but considering how much I use it and how good a job it does, I consider it worth it. So now we'll talk about some images from Mount Wilson. This is a set of Mars from 2018 using the 6-inch Brashear. One issue that you will notice here, because this is not a zero color refractor, this is a kind of a normal refractor which has some chromatic aberration, we do have to use a monochrome camera with filters and then reassemble the color image from the 3 filters. So in this case, we used a 100 nanometer wideband red, 100 nanometer wideband green. However, with the blue, we had to use a 10 nanometer blue filter because the characteristics of this particular lens, the blue is, there's so much chromatic aberration that if you were to use a wideband blue, you still would not be able to get a good focus. So we have to use a narrow band blue filter. The problem with that is we're cutting out so much light. We have to increase our exposure, which gives the atmosphere more time to blur our image, but it's a trade-off we have to make. This is an example of Jupiter and Saturn from that same telescope. And again, especially with Saturn, because Saturn is so dim, the reason Saturn has this blue tint is because the exposure in the blue was so long that even with the good seeing at Mount Wilson, the exposure gave the atmosphere time to blur Saturn a little bit. So the blue image is a little bit blurry, more blurry than the red and the green. That's why we have this blue tint to Saturn. And again, here is our schematic of our lens where we have our chromatic aberration. But with this particular telescope, the blue is much, much worse than it's shown here. Also note that this is a 6-inch telescope, so our resolution is also reduced. And having said for these various issues, this is a pretty decent image of Jupiter, considering it's a 6-inch telescope and assembled from 3 separate images. So this is, do you see these 3 images moving?
Yes.
Okay, so this is some movies that were just taken this past August from Mount Wilson, and this was using the 16-inch Meade. So this is with a modern telescope with good optics and a good mount and everything. And this is taken on August 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. And these are kind of 1 hour to 1.5 hour videos. And these were taken with a color camera. And you can see that the detail on these images are much higher than with the 6-inch telescope because we have more aperture. And as you see how in some of these polar regions there's a lot of detail in the clouds here. This is also an image of Saturn from the 16-inch Meade on the 23rd of August. And we have a lot of nice banding. However, we see this color, this red tinge and this blue tinge. That is a result of the atmosphere, which the Meade cannot correct. So in the case of the Schupmann, we would not be seeing this red and blue tinges because the telescope can correct for that. This is a combination of, or just a comparison. These images were taken in 2019 with the 6-inch refractor at Mount Wilson, the 16-inch Meade, and with the 60-inch big telescope at Mount Wilson. These are each assembled from red, green, and blue. And we see that in general, the 6-inch image has somewhat low resolution compared to the other 2 because of its smaller aperture. However, we also see that perhaps the 60-inch has less resolution than the 16-inch, and that goes back to our plot of the quality of the atmosphere versus, or the quality of our image given the atmosphere and the aperture. As the aperture gets bigger, the image gets worse. So even though it's difficult to compare these directly because they were taken on different nights, this does kind of show that a 16-inch telescope at Mount Wilson is doing better than the 60 on nights of not perfect seeing. Having said that, all these are pretty decent images. So we've also taken some high resolution images of the moon with the 6-inch refractor at Mount Wilson, and these are monochrome. So this is with a wideband red filter. So this is up here on the left side is the straight wall, and on the right side is the Theophilus region. The Stoffler and the Cassini regions. And then these are some full disk images of the moon. And this is an example of the standard exposure versus the high resolution version. The standard exposure is on the left, the high resolution is on the right. And with this, we're getting into the artsy question. So there's really no right or wrong answer. It's you just do what you like. And here's an example of a high resolution, high dynamic range image from Mount Wilson, 6-inch refractor on the moon. And just to show how much detail there is, here's the crater here on the upper left, Plato, and here it's been blown up. There's been no difference, no changes other than it's simply been cropped and blown up. And you can see all the detail on the floor of Plato. And normally the floor of Plato is a typical test case for the amount of detail your system can see. If you can see detail on the floor of Plato, you're doing pretty good. And there's a lot of detail on Plato. So you can imagine how big the moon would be if the entire moon were printed at this same scale as Plato. And here's just some other examples. This is with a 4-inch f9 refractor. Again, here on the left side is the standard exposure. The right side is a high dynamic range from earlier.
Hurry, Alan, it started.
Yes, it did. And you will be muted.
Here's another example from June 30th. Again, standard versus high dynamic range. And here's just a comparison, just to show how one thing that makes the planet so hard, this is just a cut and paste where the size of Jupiter is compared to the size of the moon on the same night. We see how much smaller the planets are than the moon, which is one of the things that make them hard to pull out any detail. And this is a tricolor image of Jupiter from a 4-inch f9 refractor. Again, the 4-inch f9 does have chromatic aberration, so we cannot use a color camera. We have to take red, green, and blue and then paste them together later. And keep in mind that part of the problem or this disadvantage is it just has inherently lower resolution because it is a 4-inch telescope. This white dot, it's not 1 arcsecond, it is the resolution limit of the telescope. So the telescope at 4 inches cannot see anything smaller than this. So we're probably operating at or near the resolution limit of this telescope at this time. And this is that same telescope set up with Jupiter and Saturn. there has been one advantage this past summer on those, when we get many days of that very hot and humid air, provides for very, very good seeing. It's a very ideal situation to observe the planets. We also, for example, not only can take color as assembled with red, green, and blue images, but we can take infrared and methane images of Jupiter. And again, the white dots are the resolution limit of the telescope. And here's a movie, about a 1 hour movie from the 4-inch f9 refractor. So each one of these individual images or pieces of this movie is assembled from red, green, and blue. And then that's done every 5 minutes over the course of an hour. We piece them together to make the movie. And this is just an example to show that you don't need much to do some good work on the moon. The left image is a result of a video that was taken with an iPhone through a telescope. I did not take the video, I downloaded it off the internet, but then I did the processing. Now, of course, the resolution is much less than the comparison image on the right, which is the image from the 6-inch refractor at Mount Wilson. So it's not really fair to compare them in that way, but in and of itself, considering just with an iPhone and some good work with the software, we still can make a pretty decent image of the moon. And as my final slide, this high resolution technique is not just for the moon and the planets, it also can be done for landscape. And this is a picture of Stellophane in the fall, obviously. The standard exposure, which is just taken with an iPhone camera, which is in the lower right. And then it was run through the high dynamic range processing to pull out the colors and the details. And again, this is now artsy, so there's really no right or wrong answer. You can just adjust the image however you like it. So that's the end of my presentation. If anyone has any questions, I can answer them.
Thank you, Tom. I think what we do, if people here have questions, if you could shout them out, Laura can repeat them in case we.
Yeah.
And then people online have questions, we can ask those too. I do have one question. Are there any anti-reflection coatings on that 13-inch lens for the Schupmann?
No. At the time, that lens was made in the early 90s, 93, 94. And at that time, the putting coatings on a big lens like that was not as mature as it is nowadays. If that project were to be done nowadays, it would definitely have an anti-reflection coating put on. But at the time, between just the maturity of the technology and also the expense, it was not done.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I guess if there's no other questions, I want to thank you again for joining us. We all enjoyed that, and hopefully I'll see you up at Stellophane sometime.
Yep, actually, I'm here now, and I'm heading right out to the telescope and doing some more imaging.
All right, well, we won't keep you any longer since it's a good night.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.